In the rugged heart of 1880s America, feuds were often settled with the cold, hard finality of a rifle. They were stories written in gunpowder and blood, tales of violent retribution passed down through generations. But in the secluded valleys of Appalachia, a different kind of war was brewing. This was a conflict fought not on the open field, but in the shadowy corners of the mind. The Hatfield clan, a name already etched in local lore, decided on a new path to victory. They would not use bullets to break their rivals. Instead, they would use fear, suspicion, and the slow, grinding pressure of psychological torment. Their goal was not to kill their enemies, but to unmake them, piece by painstaking piece. This was a campaign of whispers, not shouts. It was a war of nerves, where the battlefield was the hearth and home of their targets. The Hatfields understood a profound truth about human nature. They knew that a man could withstand a direct assault, that he could fight back against a visible threat. But how does one fight a shadow? How does one combat a rumor that spreads like wildfire through a tight-knit community? The Hatfields weaponized the very air their rivals breathed. They turned neighbors into spies, friendly greetings into sources of anxiety, and the familiar sounds of the night into harbingers of unseen menace. This was a chillingly modern form of warfare, waged a century before its time. Their methods were subtle, yet devastatingly effective. They sought to isolate their victims, to sever the bonds of trust and community that were the lifeblood of rural existence. A man who cannot trust his neighbor is a man already defeated. A family that fears the creak of their own floorboards is a family living in a prison of their own making. The Hatfields did not need to draw a gun when they could make a man fear his own shadow. They meticulously crafted scenarios designed to instill a constant, low-level dread. This was not the quick, hot anger of a typical feud. It was a cold, calculated, and patient destruction of the human spirit. The story of this silent war is a chilling tale of manipulation. It reveals how a determined family could systematically dismantle the lives of their adversaries without ever throwing a punch or firing a shot. Through careful planning and a deep understanding of human psychology, the Hatfields achieved a total and terrifying victory. They drove families from their ancestral lands, broke their wills, and erased their presence from the valley. This is the story of that unseen weapon and the deep scars it left on the people who fell victim to its insidious power. A testament to the fact that the most frightening battles are often the ones fought entirely within the mind. Silas Peaton was the first to feel the cold touch of the Hatfields' new strategy. He was a man of simple means, a farmer whose family had worked the same plot of land for generations. He was respected, if not widely known, a quiet fixture in the community. The Hatfields' campaign against him began not with a threat, but with a whisper. A rumor, light as air, began to circulate. It was said that Silas had been seen talking to revenue agents, a grave accusation, in a region where moonshining was a way of life and a source of defiant pride. The story had no source, no proof, but it didn't need one. It was planted like a seed in the fertile soil of local suspicion, and the Hatfields simply waited for it to grow. Soon the whispers turned into cold shoulders. Men who had known Silas his whole life would suddenly find something interesting to look at on the far side of the road when he approached. Conversations would halt when he entered the general store, only to resume in hushed tones the moment he left. He was no longer invited to barn raisings or community gatherings. The invisible wall that rose around him was more impenetrable than any physical barrier. Silas, a man who had always been part of the community's fabric, was now being systematically unraveled from it. He was becoming a ghost in his own life, present in body, but entirely absent from the social world he had always known. The isolation was a heavy burden, but the Hatfields added another layer of pressure. They began to stage small, unsettling events. A fence post on Silas's property would be found inexplicably moved. A tool he had left by the barn would reappear on his front porch. These were minor things, easily dismissed on their own, but they created a pattern of subtle disruption. It was a way of telling Silas that he was being watched, that his private space was not truly his own. the psychological toll was immense. He began to doubt his own memory, to question his own senses. The world around him, once solid and predictable, now felt unstable and menacing. Silas Peaton's spirit began to fray. The constant suspicion from his neighbors and the unending series of strange occurrences wore him down. His wife grew fearful, his children were taunted, and his farm work suffered from his distracted, anxious state. The Hatfields never laid a hand on him, but they were dismantling his life with surgical precision. The goal was not to harm him physically, but to make his existence in the valley untenable. They were proving a chilling hypothesis, that a man could be driven from his home not by force, but by the crushing weight of being utterly and completely alone, a pariah in the only world he had ever known. After the successful isolation of Silas Peaton, the Hatfields turned their attention to Jeremiah Quincy. Quincy was a more stubborn man, proud and less concerned with public opinion. For him, a different approach was needed. The Hatfields' campaign against the Quincy family was one of atmospheric terror, designed to turn their own home into a place of fear. It started with sounds in the night, a branch snapping just outside the window, a single mournful whistle carried on the wind, seeming to come from all directions at once. At first, Jeremiah dismissed it as the wind or wild animals, but the sounds became more specific, more deliberate. The Quincy family began to feel as though they were under constant surveillance. During the day, they would catch fleeting glimpses of a figure at the edge of the woods, someone who would melt back into the trees the moment they were spotted. At night, they would hear soft footsteps circling the cabin, always just beyond the reach of the lantern light. The Hatfields were masters of suggestion. They rarely showed themselves, allowing the Quincy's imaginations to do the heavy work. Was it one person or many? Were they armed? What did they want? The not knowing was the worst part, a constant gnawing anxiety that settled over the household like a suffocating fog. The psychological pressure escalated. Objects began to appear on their property with no explanation. A child's doll, old and dirty, was once found sitting on their well cover. A dead raven was left hanging from the handle of their front door. Each item was a silent message, a symbol of some unknown but malevolent intent. These were not direct threats of violence, but something far more unnerving. They were violations of the sanctity of the home, proof that the family was vulnerable at any time. Jeremiah Quincy, a man who feared no mortal confrontation, found himself battling an enemy he could neither see nor understand, and the strain began to show on his face and in his weary eyes. The Quincy family became prisoners in their own home. They barred their doors and windows at dusk, starting at every creak and groan of the old cabin. Sleep offered little respite as nightmares plagued the children, and Jeremiah and his wife lay awake, listening to the whispering woods around them. The Hatfields had successfully transformed the family's sanctuary into the epicenter of their fear. The constant stress eroded their health and their resolve. Jeremiah's famous stubbornness began to crumble, not in the face of a direct challenge, but under the relentless, invisible siege that had been laid upon his mind and his home. The woods he had known his entire life now seemed alien and full of watching eyes. With the Peaton and Quincy families reeling, the Hatfields widened their net. They began to target other families perceived as rivals or allies of their enemies. The methods were now refined, a chilling repertoire of psychological tactics deployed across the valley. The campaign became more organized. Strangers, men with no known ties to the area, would appear at a target's farm. They would ask for a drink of water or for directions to a non-existent town. Their questions were polite, but their eyes were not. They would linger just a little too long, their gaze sweeping over the property, cataloging the layout of the barn, the number of children, the quality of the livestock. These encounters left families feeling exposed and vulnerable. The strangers were ghosts. They arrived without warning and vanished without a trace, leaving behind a residue of pure dread. Who were they? Who sent them? The questions would hang in the air for days afterward, poisoning the family's sense of security. The Hatfields were demonstrating their reach, showing that they could bring outsiders into this closed community at will. It was a power play, a way of saying that no corner of the valley was beyond their influence. The targeted families felt as if they were living on a stage, their lives being watched and judged by a hostile, unseen audience. The harassment of property also became more daring. It was no longer just a misplaced tool or a moved fence post. Gates would be left open in the middle of the night, allowing livestock to wander off and become lost or injured. Fields that had been carefully planted would be disturbed, with small sections trampled as if by a group of men who had stood there for hours, simply watching the house. In one documented instance, a family awoke to find every single one of their chickens had been let out of the coop, unharmed but scattered across the property, a chaotic and unnerving sight to greet the dawn. This was economic pressure disguised as a haunting. This phase of the campaign was designed to create a sense of overwhelming, pervasive threat. The Hatfields were showing their targets that the world was no longer safe or predictable. The social isolation, the nightly terrors, and the constant low-grade property damage combined to form an unbearable burden. People began to talk, but only in hushed tones. They spoke of bad luck, of curses, of a spreading chill that was settling over certain homesteads. No one dared to name the source of this chill, but everyone knew where it came from. The Hatfields were asserting their dominance not through open conflict, but by becoming the valley's resident ghost story, a terrifying and ever-present force. What made the Hatfields' campaign so uniquely terrifying was its methodical nature. This was not a series of random acts of malice driven by impulsive anger. It was a calculated, almost scientific experiment in psychological warfare. Hidden away from prying eyes, the senior members of the Hatfield family kept detailed records. In journals bound in simple leather, they chronicled their efforts. They noted which tactics worked best on which personality types. They recorded the exact sequence of events that led to Silas Peaton's social collapse, and the specific sounds and symbols that shattered Jeremiah Quincy's peace of mind. These journals reveal a chillingly detached and analytical approach. They read less like the diaries of angry feudists and more like the lab notes of sociologists conducting a dark experiment. They would debate the merits of different strategies. Should they start with rumors or with nocturnal disturbances? Was it more effective to make a target feel watched or to make them feel cursed? They analyzed the results with cold objectivity. Quincy shows resistance to social pressure. One entry might read, recommend escalation of atmospheric tactics. Focus on family, especially children's fears. They were not just trying to scare their rivals, they were studying fear itself. This record-keeping allowed them to refine and improve their methods over time. They developed a playbook of psychological torment. For a proud man, they would attack his reputation. For a religious family, they would use symbols that hinted at demonic forces. For a family with young children, they would create disturbances that seemed to target the children's sense of safety. Each campaign was tailored to the specific vulnerabilities of the target. This bespoke cruelty was what made their tactics so devastatingly effective. They weren't just throwing stones in the dark, they were aiming them with pinpoint accuracy at the weakest points in a family's psychological armor. The Hatfields' approach was patient and incremental. They understood that a sudden, major event could be traced back to them and might provoke a violent response. Instead, they built the pressure slowly, with 100 small cuts. A misplaced object here, a strange noise there, a cold glance from a neighbor. Each individual incident was small enough to be deniable, small enough to make the victim question their own sanity. But taken together, they formed an inescapable web of anxiety. The Hatfields were true architects of fear, carefully designing and constructing a prison of the mind for each of their chosen targets. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Hatfields' campaign was their ability to maintain a facade of complete normalcy. In public, they were pillars of the community. They attended church services, their voices joining in the hymns. They conducted business at the general store with polite efficiency, tipping their hats to the very people whose lives they were secretly dismantling. This public performance was a crucial part of their strategy. It created a baffling disconnect for their victims and for the community at large. How could these respectable, God-fearing men be responsible for such malevolent deeds? This mask of civility served multiple purposes. First, it provided them with a powerful alibi. When a victim like Silas Peaton or Jeremiah Quincy finally broke and made accusations, they sounded hysterical and unhinged. Who would believe that the calm, well-mannered Hatfield patriarch who had just shared a pew with them on Sunday was orchestrating a campaign of terror? The accusations seemed outlandish, the desperate ramblings of a troubled mind. The Hatfields weaponized their own respectability, turning it into a shield that deflected all suspicion. It was a masterful act of gaslighting an entire community. Furthermore, their public behavior sowed confusion and doubt among their targets. Imagine the psychological torment of sharing a polite nod with the very man you suspect is terrorizing your family at night. This dissonance was profoundly unsettling. It made the victims question their own judgment. Perhaps they were mistaken. Perhaps they were imagining things. The Hatfields' friendly demeanor in the light of day made the terrors of the night seem even more surreal and unbelievable. This constant oscillation between civility and menace kept their victims off balance, unable to find solid ground on which to stand and fight back. This duality also allowed the Hatfields to gather information. During a casual conversation at the post office or after a church service, they could subtly probe for the effects of their campaign. They could ask a neighbor about the Quincy family's health or comment on how Silas Peaton seemed withdrawn lately. They could gauge the community's mood and measure the success of their rumors. Their public life was not separate from their secret war, it was an integral part of it. It was the observation deck from which they could watch their dark experiments unfold, all while wearing the comforting and disarming mask of an ordinary neighbor. Decades after the valley fell silent, a collection of letters and journals was discovered, hidden beneath the floorboards of the old Hatfield homestead. These documents, written in the steady hand of the family patriarch Elias Hatfield, provide an unprecedented window into the cold logic behind their reign of terror. They are not the rantings of madmen, but the calculated reflections of strategists. The writings confirm that every action was deliberate, every psychological blow carefully planned and recorded. They reveal a mindset that saw this silent warfare as a more refined and righteous path to victory. One chilling journal entry, dated April 1883, details the initial planning against Silas Peaton. Elias wrote, "A bullet is a fool's tool. It ends a life but creates a martyr. A reputation, however, can be unmade. We will make Peaton a stranger in his own land. Let the town itself be our weapon." This passage shows a clear and conscious decision to forego violence in favor of social ostracism. It highlights their understanding that community was both a source of strength and a critical vulnerability. They saw their rivals not as men to be killed, but as social structures to be dismantled. A letter from Elias to his eldest son, written during the campaign against the Quincy family, offers further insight. "The Quincy man is proud," he wrote. "He will not break from whispers. His fear must come from within his own walls. The night is our canvas, and his house is our subject. We will not touch him, but he will feel our presence in every shadow and every creak of the floor. A man who fears his own home is a man who is already lost." This demonstrates the tailored approach they took, adapting their tactics to exploit the specific psychology of their target. The letter reads like a lesson from a master of a dark art to his apprentice. The documents also reveal the Hatfields' justification for their actions. They did not see themselves as villains. In their minds, they were instruments of a natural order, purging the valley of weaker, less deserving families. "This land demands strength," Elias wrote in a final reflective journal entry. "Not the brute strength of the fist, but the enduring strength of the will. We have tested our neighbors and found them wanting. Their departure is not our crime, it is their failure. We remain because we are fit to remain." This chilling self-righteousness framed their cruelty not as a sin, but as a necessary and even noble act of purification. The cumulative effect of the Hatfields' campaign was inevitable. One by one, the targeted families began to break. The first to leave was Silas Peaton. After months of being an outcast, his farm neglected, and his family living in a state of constant stress, he sold his land for a fraction of its worth. He packed his family's meager belongings onto a wagon and left the valley without a word of goodbye to the neighbors who had forsaken him. His departure was a quiet, sorrowful affair, but for the Hatfields, it was a resounding victory. It was proof that their methods worked. Jeremiah Quincy held out longer. His pride was a formidable fortress, but even the strongest walls will crumble under a relentless siege. The nightly terrors, the isolation, and the constant fear for his children's safety eventually wore him down to a husk of his former self. The breaking point came when his youngest daughter became too terrified to sleep in her own bed, her nights filled with visions of faces in the window. Seeing the deep and lasting fear in his child's eyes was the one blow Quincy could not withstand. He, too, sold his property to a buyer, with quiet ties to the Hatfield clan, and moved his family west, seeking a place where the woods did not whisper his name. As more families succumbed, a pattern emerged. The psychological pressure would build until life became simply unbearable. The constant anxiety led to failing health, neglected farms, and broken spirits. The decision to leave was often framed as a personal choice, a search for better opportunities elsewhere. Few ever spoke the truth aloud, for fear of sounding insane or attracting further trouble. They simply vanished, their homes left empty or sold for a pittance. The valley grew quieter, the community smaller and more homogeneous. The spreading chill had done its work, selectively pruning the population according to the Hatfields' design. The final families to leave did so in a state of utter defeat. They had been overcome by an enemy they could never fight. There were no bodies, no battlefields, only the hollowed-out feeling of a life unmade. They left behind their ancestral homes, their family histories, and the graves of their kin. Their surrender was absolute. They were not just defeated, they were erased. The Hatfields watched them go, their faces impassive, their victory silent but total. The valley now belonged to them, not by deed of war, but by the slow, patient, and terrifying conquest of the human mind. In the end, the valley was remade in the Hatfields' image. The lands once belonging to the Petons, the Quincy's, and others were quietly absorbed into the ever-expanding Hatfield domain. The community that remained was one forged in fear and compliance. Those who stayed knew, either consciously or subconsciously, that their place in the valley was conditional. It depended on their silent acceptance of the Hatfields' dominance. The feud was over, not because peace had been made, but because all opposition had been systematically and psychologically eliminated. The Hatfields saw their victory as a validation of their philosophy. As Elias Hatfield's journals attest, they believed they had acted not out of malice, but out of a sense of higher purpose. They saw themselves as stewards of the land, and their campaign as a necessary culling of the weak. In their eyes, the families who fled were not victims of a cruel plot, but failures in a natural test of will and resilience. They had proven themselves unfit for the hard life the valley demanded. This self-serving justification allowed the Hatfields to live with their actions, not as aggressors, but as righteous patriarchs securing a legacy for their children. This belief system was passed down through the Hatfield generations. The stories they told their children were not of psychological torment, but of strength and perseverance. They were tales of how the family had weathered hardships and through superior intellect and fortitude had come to prosper where others had failed. The names of Peton and Quincy faded from local memory, becoming little more than footnotes in the story of the Hatfields' ascendance. The silence of the vanquished allowed the victors to write their own history, a sanitized version where their cruelty was recast as strength and their psychological warfare was forgotten. The legacy of the Hatfields' silent war is a haunting one. It is a story of how an entire community can be subjugated without a single shot being fired. It serves as a dark testament to the power of fear, isolation, and manipulation. The empty fields where homes once stood, the old property lines that still bear witness to the vanished families, and the rediscovered journals filled with cold calculations all speak to a chilling truth. The deepest wounds are not always those inflicted upon the body. The most complete victories are sometimes won in the quiet, shadowed battlegrounds of the human mind, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of profound and unsettling silence.